So, welcome to the Monday Study Group on the 20th of January 2025, a big day in our country. I can think of three reasons. Maybe it's your birthday, that would be a fourth reason. But it's Inauguration Day, and as of this moment, President Trump has already been inaugurated. And it's also Martin Luther King Day. And hopefully, in your thoughts and prayers, and maybe in attendance, you'll be at a Martin Luther King service, or at least be thankful and grateful for his life and witness for justice and peace. We need to remember that. And then it's also the college football national championship game between Notre Dame and Ohio State. And I don't have a dog in that fight. So, all right. Maybe you do. We are in Mark chapter 10. I had trouble making this video. This is the second time I've made it, so I think I know what I'm going to say, when you make a video a second time. But I have no idea what went wrong. My computer decided that I was making a JPEG as if I were taking a picture rather than an MP4 file, which is a video file. So my hope is that the next 30 minutes of this video will not show up as a JPEG, but will show up instead as an MP4. I do notice that there are some pauses in the video, so I hope that's not annoying to you. It is a little annoying to me. And I hope it's not a sign that the video is not being made correctly. Well, we'll do what we can. So we're in Mark chapter 10 and verse 32. This is Jesus' third prediction of his death, his suffering, death, and resurrection, called Passion Predictions. There's one in chapter 8, one in chapter 9, and a third one in chapter 10. All of this goes to show that for the writer of this gospel, for Mark, the death and resurrection of Jesus is central. It's what everything is leading to. I forget which New Testament scholar said that, in his opinion, the Gospel of Mark was a passion account, a passion narrative with an extended introduction. So important for Mark is the death and resurrection of Jesus, which now we see how everything leads up to it. This is Jesus' one and only visit to Jerusalem in the Gospel of Mark. Very, very likely Jesus made more than one. But Mark has condensed everything down into one Galilean ministry and one journey to Jerusalem where Jesus teaches, and then he's arrested and suffers, dies, and rises. So all of that in one fast-moving narrative in which one of Mark's favorite words is immediately. So they were on the road. Mark likes to mark transitions in his narrative with these little geographical markers. They are on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus is walking ahead of them. That is, he's leading them. They're not excited about getting to Jerusalem, given what Jesus has said about what's going to happen there. And the reaction of his followers is, and I think the they includes more than just the 12, all those who were following Jesus were amazed and afraid. They're Galileans, they're heading to Judea. There's always been a conflict between Galileans and Judeans, but given what Jesus has said about what's going to happen, their reactions run from amazement to fear. And in order to emphasize for the third time what is going to happen there, and to try to correct the disciples' misunderstanding of Jesus' own role in all this, he takes the 12 aside and he begins to tell them We are going up to Jerusalem, and I, the Son of Man, will be handed over to the Jewish authorities, to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will officially condemn me to death. Then they will hand me over to the Romans, to the Gentiles, and the Romans will mock me and spit upon me and flog me and kill me. He doesn't say crucified. Neither do the other two passion predictions say crucified. But we know that that was the outcome. And it was the Romans' favorite form of execution, especially for those whom they thought of as threats to their authority. And after 3 days I will rise again. It's as if no one hears that. The disciples don't hear it. Every time Jesus has talked about rising from the dead, they wonder what rising from the dead could mean. That's not supposed to happen to the Messiah. Well, Jesus' concept of messiahship involves the suffering servant of Isaiah, more than just the king like David. Each time Jesus has predicted his death and resurrection, that has been followed, each of those sections in Mark, in chapters 8 and 9 and 10, each of those sections has been followed by teaching on discipleship. And you could go back and look at what immediately happens after Jesus predicts his death. In one case, Peter rebukes him, and Jesus has to sternly rebuke Peter and the rest of the disciples for their failure to understand that his messiahship involves suffering. The second time after he predicts his passion, it's as if they completely ignore it and go on to have an argument about who is the greatest. And now the third time, we get something similar happening. James and John come to Jesus privately. They were two of the three whom Jesus took up on the mountain of transfiguration. The other was Peter, but he's not here. James and John come alone and say to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever you ask." Now, in Matthew's gospel, it's the mother of James and John who comes to make this request. Did Matthew do that to soften the criticism of the disciples? To me, it shows their weakness if they sent their mother to make this request. But here in Mark, this is probably the way it historically really was. They came directly to Jesus and they said something that maybe a 10-year-old kid would say to their parents, "Mom and Dad, we want you to do whatever we ask you to do." And as a wise parent, you would say what Jesus says to his disciples, "Well, what is it that you want me to do for you? I'm not just going to give you a blank check to do whatever you want with." And they said to him, "Well, here's what we want, sir." Notice this, sir. We want us to sit at your right hand, one on your left and one on your right in your glory. Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. I guess there's no sir there. I was implying that. So these two, James and John, are asking for the two most prominent positions in what they conceive of as what's going to happen when they all get to Jerusalem. That there's going to be this great incoming of the kingdom of God, with Jesus being declared the powerful Messiah, throwing out the Romans and establishing God's kingdom. And when that happens, we want to be number one and number two in your kingly rule. Jesus says to them, as we, the readers, must know that he's going to say, "You do not know what you are asking. You still don't get it. I have 3 times predicted my suffering and death in Jerusalem, and you think something else is going to happen. You're completely mistaken. You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm going to drink, or be baptized with the baptism I'm about to be baptized with? Jesus doesn't think so. He thinks that they are not ready for the suffering that the 2 images of cup and baptism symbolize, in addition to symbolizing the Eucharist and baptism. In the Old Testament, these symbols of cup and being overwhelmed or immersed in water are threats to life. They reply, James and John do, sure, we are able. They don't know what they are asking for. They think that what Jesus is implying about his cup and his baptism must have something to do with fellowship in the community, or joining Jesus in his leadership position in the coming kingdom with the privileges of cup and baptism, maybe. Clearly, they don't get it. So Jesus says to them, well, in fact, the time will come when you will be drinking the cup that I am drinking, and you will be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. That is, you will have to undergo the suffering implied in those two metaphors. But to sit at my right and left hand, that's already been decided, and it hasn't been decided by me. It's been decided by those for whom it has been prepared. It's been decided by all that John had gone to Jesus and requested these places of honor, power, and authority. James and John were angry, or the disciples, were angry with James and John. So Jesus called them all together, and he said to them, look, there are 2 different ways to think about power and authority and responsibility. In the Gentile world, in the Roman pagan world, those whom they recognize as their rulers lorded over them. That is, they used their power and authority and wealth to dominate and oppress those whom they are ruling over. And their great ones are in fact tyrants over them. That is clearly a negative image of rulership. They exercise their power for their own well-being rather than the well-being of their citizens. But Jesus said, in the Jesus community, in the fellowship of the disciples who follow Jesus, among us, among you, it is not to be this way. For whoever wishes to be great among you, to be a ruler, or to be first, or to be first and second, and to sit at my right and left hand in the coming kingdom, whoever wishes to be great or first among you must be your servant and the slave of all. A very different way of thinking about the use of leadership. For Jesus, it's primarily about service. The word for servant here is the most common word in the New Testament for ministries of all kinds. Men and women are both called servants, diakonoi, in the New Testament, and it refers to ministry without specifying the kind of ministry that would be involved with, let's say, an apostle or a teacher. Diakonoi is the origin of our term deacon, but in the New Testament it played a wider role than deacons usually play in our churches. So James and John and all the 12 are urgently called to be servants of one another and of the communities that they will eventually lead. And Jesus gives them a reason for that. The reason is that he himself, the Son of Man, who as the glorious Son of God and the Messiah, should have been served by everyone else, he in fact the Son of Man came not to be served by others, but to serve, and to in fact give his life, all that he had, to give his life as a ransom for many. That is to set other people free. Free from sin, free from death, free from punishment, free for the love of God and neighbor, to set people free from all that oppressed them, in order that they might be the children of God and be a part of God's kingdom. Did they get the lesson? Well, probably not, as we're going to see in the following two passages. Chapter 10 ends with the story of the healing of a blind man. And it's interesting to note that this whole section of teaching from chapter 8 through chapter 10 began with the story of the healing of a blind man in, I think, Bethsaida. Yeah, Mark 8:22. That was a two-stage healing of a blind man. Here and there Jesus touched his eyes and so forth, and the man was healed in two stages. Here Jesus doesn't even touch the blind man. The method of healing is it's just indirect. Jesus doesn't use any means. He directly heals the man just by his word. He tells the man his faith has made him well. So Mark has bookended this whole section of the travel to Jerusalem for Jesus' eventual demise, bookended it with these two stories of a blind man on each side of the material in the middle, on each side of the three passion predictions. So they come to Jericho. Well, we've now gone from Galilee across the Jordan River into the Transjordan area, avoiding Samaria, traveling down the east side of the Jordan River, and crossing back over into Judea at Jericho. Jericho was a beautiful place. It had been made by Herod the Great, that Herod under whose rule Jesus was born. It had been made his winter palace, and it was a place of palm trees and water, and below sea level, several hundred feet below sea level. But up in Jerusalem, we're at a very different altitude. So Jesus is now in Jericho, 18 miles from Jerusalem, and he and his disciples were passing through the city, leaving it, and on the way out of town, they come across a blind man named Bartimaeus. Now, Bartimaeus itself means son of Timaeus, like bar mitzvah means son of the commandment. Timaeus means son of Timaeus. And so for Mark to call him Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, is redundant. But that's his name, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar who wasn't always blind. He lost his sight somewhere, maybe early in his life. And he's sitting by the roadside, as he has for many years, begging alms so that he has something to live on. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he must have known that Jesus had a reputation for being a healer. And so he cries out loudly. He shouts, Mark says, shouts saying, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." This Son of David title is the only time this title is used in all of Mark, is here. Twice the man cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." He knows Jesus' reputation for compassion and healing, and he calls out to get Jesus' attention. But just as the disciples sternly ordered the parents who were bringing their children to be blessed by Jesus, and sternly ordered them not to do that. So here the crowd, probably including the disciples, sternly order this blind man to get out of the way, to be quiet, to not be calling out so loudly. And they sternly ordered him to be quiet. But that set him off even more loudly. He would not be put down. He would not be ignored. He urgently called out again, "Son of David," a messianic title, probably implying that he had the same concept of Messiah that the disciples mistakenly have, namely that Jesus was going to be a powerful kingly ruler like David and destroy the Romans. As we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the War Scroll, the hope of the Jewish people was that the Messiah would come and throw out the Roman rulers and restore Israel's power and independence. But instead, he has come to be a different kind of Messiah, and the Son of David it's not wrong, it's just inadequate, isn't it? It's not the whole story. Son of David, he says, have mercy on me. So Jesus stood still and said to his followers, call him here. He gives his followers a role now in bringing the blind man to him, this blind man that they had sternly rebuked. And now they say to the blind man, get up, take heart, he is calling you. They've stopped rebuking him, and now they tell him that Jesus wants to talk to him. And so they convey that message, and in a somewhat dramatic fashion, it seems to me, the blind man throws off his cloak, springs up, and comes to Jesus. And Jesus says to him, what do you want me to do for you? Jesus puts the responsibility of responding on the blind man himself. He isn't going to intervene unless the blind man asks him to. And he wants to know specifically, not just have mercy on me. What does that mean? Forgive my sins, help my family, give me some money. No, he says mercy means restore my sight. I want to see again. The blind man said, teacher, my teacher, a sign of respect, let me see again. And Jesus says to him, without touching him or even commanding any evil spirits, he simply says to him, you can go now. Your faith has made you well. Just as he said to the woman with the issue of blood back in the chapter when they were on their way to heal Jairus' daughter. The woman who had had this issue of blood for many years. Jesus said to her, your faith has made you well. And so he says that to this blind man, and immediately he regained his sight miraculously, and he followed Jesus on the way. That is, he becomes a disciple. He follows Jesus on the way. And so we are now set for Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. They were approaching Jerusalem. We've been getting closer and closer. We've left Galilee. We've gone down the east side of the Jordan River. We've arrived at Jericho, 18 miles away. And now we're within 2 miles of the walls of Jerusalem. We are on the Mount of Olives in the 2 villages of Bethphage and Bethany, which were villages on each side of the Mount of Olives. We don't know exactly where Bethphage was, but we do know that Bethany was on or near the Mount of Olives, probably on the east side, I think. And so Jesus is now within 2 miles of his destiny. And before he enters the city in the way he wants to enter it, he sends 2 of his disciples, and I like to think they are James and John, the same 2 who have no concept of what servant leadership really means, in contrast to the blind man whose faith in Jesus allows him to humbly receive the recovery of sight that he has wanted. The disciples don't see. The blind man now does see. And now perhaps it was John who were sent as servants, as if they were slaves, into the village ahead of you, whichever one it was. And Jesus says, as you enter it, you'll find there tied up a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. Well, that's a rather bold thing to say, just as if you were to go into a parking lot and find a car with the keys in the ignition and you started to drive away with it, and bystanders said, wait, that's Aunt Jane's car. You can't have that car. So Jesus suspects they're going to run into that same kind of opposition if they just take somebody else's horse. And so he tells them, if anyone says to you, why are you taking the colt? Just say, the Lord needs it, and we'll send it back here immediately. Well, the Lord, in my Bible, is capitalized. Now, in the Greek text, it's not. So it's a decision of the editors that they will capitalize the word Lord and decide that it refers to Jesus. It could simply mean owner. Lord as the owner of something. The Lord of the colt could be the owner of the colt, and in that case, perhaps that owner of the colt is a follower of Jesus, and Jesus is simply telling his disciples to say that the Lord of the colt, the owner of it, needs it and will send it back. I don't think that's as likely an explanation as it is that the word Lord here means Jesus, and that we're right to have it capitalized, but just recognize that it could have another alternative meaning. So they went away and in fact found the colt tied near a door outside the street, just as Jesus had predicted. And in fact, as they were untying it and taking it away, some of the bystanders said, hey, what are you doing? Why are you untying that colt? And so they told them just what Jesus had said, that the Lord needs it and will send it back here immediately, and they allowed them to take it. Generous on their part, trusting, and they brought the colt to Jesus, threw their cloaks on it, this animal that had never been ridden, and Jesus sat on it. Now, it seemed to us in the class this morning that you don't just sit on a horse that has never been ridden, but maybe Jesus was a horse whisperer. That is, he had the ability to calm the colt, just as he had calmed the storm on the sea. And this animal allowed Jesus to sit on it, and he then rode the colt with their cloaks on it into Jerusalem, with people spreading their outer garments on the road and putting leafy branches on the road. If they are palm branches, they came from Jericho. There are no palm trees in Jerusalem. It's a different altitude. It's too high. There are other branches, though, in the fields, and so they cut branches from trees in the field or bushes and put them on the road like a red carpet treatment for for a king or for an honorable official, and they mark the road with their coats and their branches on the way to Jerusalem. And those who went ahead and those who followed this parade of the coming king shout, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. What did they expect was going to happen when Jesus entered Jerusalem? That he would be proclaimed as king, that he would throw out the Romans, that he would establish the kingdom of God. It's the same expectation that Jesus' disciples have had, the same rejection or misunderstanding or ignoring of Jesus' 3 passion predictions about the kind of Messiah he came to be, including his resurrection, which no one has understood. They proclaim the coming king like our ancestor David, Hosanna in the highest heaven. And so Jesus, like a lowly king, in fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9, which is quoted here in this passage, and is fulfilled by Jesus riding the donkey or the colt into Jerusalem. When he entered Jerusalem, he went into the temple, looked around at everything, as it was already late, and he went back to Bethany with his disciples and stayed overnight before coming back to Jerusalem the next day for his final week of teaching and arrest, suffering, crucifixion, and resurrection. Well, I will check to see if this video got made correctly this time as an MP4 file rather than as a JPEG, but I'm not sure about that. So we'll see, and I wish you a good week, and we'll pick up with Mark chapter 11, verse 12 next time. Thank you.